I want to pause because we're past Romans chapter 9, and then last week we got into chapter 10. But the 9th chapter of Romans is the hub of everything, and how one reads it is to put it lightly, it's not a small issue. It's a really, really big issue. So I put together a little sheet over here of classical passages. So I got the lessons here, but then this bit over here are just sort of passages that we're used to reading from Romans. Because I'm 9, 10, and 11, I'm doing something different in this class than is typically done. Now, it's done in scholarly circles, it's done in universities, but it's not typically done in churches. So I need to talk a little bit about it because I was clued in. I thought, no, I don't know that I'm coming across clearly because I was wearing my spectacles. We go through the chapter verse by verse by verse, and then you see everything up close, but you don't always get the big picture. So what I want to do today, and then we'll jump back into the book, is give kind of a big picture. That's what I want to do because I've been going into analysis here. These chapters are largely viewed through the lens of Calvin and Arminius. Now, pretty much everybody agrees that the main theme of the chapter is sovereignty. And that's what I've called this lesson, God's sovereignty. That is to say, He's king. He's Lord over all. He's not wondering how the story is going to end. It's not as though Adam and Eve sinned in the garden and God said, oops, I hadn't thought of that. I better come up with something. He's sovereign. But then the question is sovereignty over what? So I put up here on the board, and I'm focusing today on chapter 9. Because however you read chapter 9 affects how you read chapter 10, affects how you read chapter 11. Chapter 9 is the linchpin. The traditional reading, and I'm departing from that in this class. Now, note that I'm not going to preach that from the pulpit. If I depart from that in the class, that is for discussion and study. But at any rate, we'll see where it goes. Sovereignty in regard to the salvation of individual people. That's how these chapters are read. Which individual people are saved, which individual people are not saved. We associate that with Calvin, but I've read enough to tell you that it doesn't begin with John Calvin. You can find it in Martin Luther. You can find it in Thomas Aquinas. You can go all the way back to St. Augustine in the 4th century. So when I say the traditional reading, I mean traditional. These chapters have been read, and these are not small names. Augustine, Aquinas, and Luther are considered bastions of Christian orthodoxy for almost 2,000 years. So any departure from the train tracks, so to speak, that they set down is not a small issue. I put the NPP reading here. We talked a little bit at the beginning class of the New Perspective on Paul, which is from all I can tell from the internet and X or Twitter or whatever you want to call. I mean, if you want to start an argument and get the fur flying and have people begin slandering each other, you can just mention that and see what happens. There are parts of it that I agree with, parts of it I don't agree with, and that's been informing the class all throughout. The point is that there are certain parts of Paul in his letters that these scholars feel need to be reread. Basically, that's what it comes down to. But that's not a small issue, because within Protestant circles, whole traditions are based on how they read Paul, particularly in Romans, Galatians, Philippians, and so forth. So, these will argue that the topic here is still sovereignty, but it has to do with God's election, not of individual people for salvation, but of nations as carriers of his message to the world. And those two nations are the Jews and the Gentiles. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and I want to pull together some passages, because Calvin has a particular way of reading these passages in chapter 9. Jacob Arminius has a particular way of reading them, and I don't think either one of them are correct. And it's not, so this view is compatible with either of these. It just means Paul in chapter 9 is not talking about what sometimes we think that he has been talking about. And that's a tough one to pull off. So, take this little sheet that I printed out. We'll come back to this, because this is all theological stuff. Classical passages here on this sheet that I handed out. Third paragraph from the bottom, and it just follows chronologically, because as I found a long time ago, I've been reading the Bible since I was a kid. You know how, well, it's true when I play the piano. You have a thing called muscle memory. Everybody know what muscle memory is? People sometimes ask, well, you play that like it's nothing. And I haven't got a single intelligent thought running through my head. My fingers have been trained to do what they're doing. You can read the Bible that way. We have certain ways of reading classical Bible passages, and we're so used to reading them in that way, it's just very, very difficult to read them in any other way. And that's not necessarily bad. If we're reading it the right way, that's entirely good. Yeah.
Whether in the traditional way or in some other way, is it a part of the equation to ask, whether how the audience read it? I mean, you might have to make a complex argument, say, for a new path. Was it complex for the original readers, or
So that's a good question. You might ask, why, if it's not broke, why fix? If it's not broke, don't fix it. Why the shift? The new reading of some of these, not all of them, but some of the passages, feels that the old reading is not informed enough by the Old Testament. It's not informed enough by the situation of Paul in the first century.
And all those things have been immediately in the mind.
Those would have been immediately in the minds of the readers. So the irony is that it would not have been complicated for them. They would have known exactly what Paul was talking about. They would not have had to go to the Greek. They were Greek speakers. And they wouldn't have had to hair split about, well, it meant this and it meant that. So the Greek text, the complicated situation between Jews and Gentiles living together in the first century, and I would just mention before class began, Paul has, between these three chapters, over 40 quotations of the Old Testament. That's a lot. And in other words, our understanding, we have to remember that Paul had been a Jew. He was a Pharisee. He was thoroughly acquainted with the Old Testament scriptures, and he quotes them richly. And so he's expecting his audience to lock into that. And that's one of the things that appeals about this to me, because I'm an Old Testament guy. That's where I did a lot of my graduate work. And so they will argue on the basis of those things that this is what the original readers would have got. And so new perspective is kind of a roundabout way of saying, actually, this is the old perspective. But we've overlaid it with the intrusion of of our own biases in later centuries. Now, what it all amounts to in terms of our theology is open-ended. I think both of these views are compatible with it. I just don't think. So let's take a look here. On this sheet here, Romans 9 through 11, it's a front and a back. Third paragraph from the bottom. Romans chapter 9, verse 1 to 5, Paul says, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen by race. So he leads off with that in Romans chapter 9, verse 1 to 5. So that sets the tone. Paul is dealing with the scandal that God's elect people have largely rejected the Messiah. That is the big scandal of the early church. I don't know if this is a good example, but it would be like if Jesus came a second time. I'm not entirely sure that this is impossible. And most of the Christian church rejected him. Would that be a scandal?
I felt like that's going to be the case for a long time.
Okay, you've already thought, well, that could happen. I mean, if Jesus came to our world today, and I'm not saying yes or no, I'm saying it's a comparable scandal.
If he had the blue sash and everything, yeah.
Everybody'd see him a mile off, say, well, there he comes. He's a German with blonde hair, blue eyes, and he's coming down with a blue sash. That's a joke. That's how he's depicted in a lot of our paintings. Of course, he was Jewish, and that's how Rembrandt depicted him, fine. But yeah, if he returned, would he find faith in the world, right? There's that passage from the scripture, in Christ return. But when Christ returns, will he find faith in the world? So that's the scandal that Paul has to deal with. And the church at Rome is made up of Jews and Gentiles. So he says here, and it's a salvific issue, because when he says here, I could wish myself accursed and cut off from Christ, isn't he saying that acceptance or rejection of Christ is something upon which your salvation depends? I think he's saying that. He's saying, my fellow Jews who have rejected Christ have been cut off from salvation. I think that he's saying that because the word accursed, that's a strong word. So that's the first passage. I don't want to go passage by passage. When we get to the fourth one, that's where the fur starts to fly. But this is an easy one. Let me see if there's any question about this particular passage. Yeah.
I don't know if it's germane, but it seems to me, I can't think of where it is, that somebody said something similar to this in the Old Testament.
Moses.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Moses in Exodus, I can't remember the spot. When God says he's going to
Oh, yes.
the Israelites, and he will use Moses to create basically a new line, and Moses says something very similar to it.
That's right after the golden calf episode. And that's another example of Paul, you could say, echoing the Old Testament tradition. He's acting as an intercessor for his people. He doesn't, if there's salvation for him but not his people, he doesn't want that. Now, that might sound extreme, but isn't that what Jesus does for all of us? Jesus becomes a curse. Isn't that what the text says? He becomes a curse for us. So there he's imitating Christ, the attitude of Christ.
This could be drawn back to this Exodus 32, 32.
I was going to say 32 and 33 is the golden calf story.
How could you say you've fallen for the golden calf? Rejected the truth.
Yeah, he's meeting in chapter 33. He's up on Mount Sinai. And let's see if I can find the verse while we have the scripture in front of us here. It does contain a passage Paul quotes, chapter 33, verse 19. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. I will show mercy on whom I show mercy. Paul quotes that here. Let's see if we can find the passage, though. It's okay if we have a moment of silence while we go through the scripture.
Verse 32.
32? Chapter 32, verse 32. If you will not forgive their sin, blot me out from the book you have written. And that's powerful. If you will not forgive their sin, blot me out from the book you have written. So there, you could say that Moses is very much, to use an expression, in the spirit of Christ. He's an intercessor. And that's important for pastors and anybody in authority to recognize. Authority is a crown, but it's a crown of thorns. If authority is used properly, it's not the sort of thing any selfish person would want for themselves, because it means servanthood. And Moses is doing that. Paul is doing that. Now, second paragraph from the bottom on this sheet, chapter 9, verses 6 to 9, Paul goes on. It is not as though the word of God has failed. So someone might say, well, so many Jews have rejected Christ, apparently God has reneged on his promise. And then he says this remarkable verse, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. So Paul is drawing a distinction between being born an Israelite and you could say being a true Israelite. Maybe an example would be, just because you're born into a Christian household, does that make you a Christian? No. No, it doesn't. God has no grandchildren, as the saying goes. It is not, therefore, the children of the flesh who are the children of God. As John the Baptist says to the Pharisees, God can raise up children from Abraham out of these stones. You're not born into it, but the children of the promise. Now that, of course, raises the question, well, who gets the promise? You don't get it through just birth, though. That much is clear. And of course, Paul's going to make it clear that you get it through what? Faith. I almost said the F word. Faith. It's a 5-letter. F-A-I. Yeah, it's a 5-letter F word. Okay. Faith. So faith for Paul is the basis. But that's tricky because anybody can have faith. Not just Jews can have faith. Gentiles can have faith. And so now he's going to move into that. Last paragraph on this first page, Romans 10:10 and beyond. And then he goes on to talk about Isaac and his sons, Jacob and Esau. Now here, Esau is the father of the Edomites. Jacob is the father of the Israelites. So we're talking in collective language. When Rebekah had conceived children by Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of his call, she was told the older will serve the younger, as it is written. This is from the book of Malachi. Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. So in other words, Jacob is to be God's vessel of salvation to the world. Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. The point is not that God loved Jacob personally and he hated Esau personally as an individual. The point is that he favored Jacob. And Jacob's offspring became the nation through which God would carry his message of mercy to the world. Esau did not. And we all know that Esau sold his birthright. But what Paul is saying here is that God had already decided on that. That was settled. Jacob was not the firstborn. Jacob and Esau were twins, but one comes out. Eli, you have a twin brother?
Yes, I do.
Who's the younger?
That would be TJ.
By how much?
A couple minutes.
Couple minutes. Yes, but TJ was grasping your heel, as I recall. They were fighting with one another in the womb as to who would be the firstborn. Not quite. So, yeah, I've got twin boys. Eli is technically the oldest, but they were born within minutes of one another. But in the ancient Near East, that's a big deal because the inheritance goes to the elder son. And yet it went to Jacob. Jacob, I don't know if you read the book of Genesis, presumably Jacob was chosen for his great moral qualities. I think everybody would agree that Jacob was a deeply morally earnest person, not deceptive in any regard, not the kind of person to connive with his mother to steal things from other people, or it's like a litany of things not to do. And of course that pushes back against sort of the Sunday school idea that we have that Bible stories were told to provide us. I was told when I was growing up in church that these stories are to provide us with good moral examples. And when I read the stories, I thought, I'm not seeing it. Where are the good moral examples? Can you get good moral lessons out of the Bible? Sure. But many of the characters in the Bible are not the most moral people.
Well, Jacob, though, through the things he suffered by God's hand, became a more noble person. And in fact, at the blessing of Joseph's sons, he put his hands.
He did. He crossed his hands over it.
Yeah.
So then you got to go in for the long game and look at the big picture. Do we see Jacob becoming a better person over the course of his life? I would say yes, absolutely. So there's a redemptive theme. But Jacob wasn't chosen because he was good. He was not a good guy. But God educated him by the end of his life to become a better man than he would have been. But the point between him and Esau, because he and Esau are reconciled, is not that Jacob's going to heaven and Esau's going to hell. The point is that God has chosen Jacob's children to be the vessel through which the message of salvation will come to the nations. And Esau was rejected for that. Will we see Esau in heaven? Well, presumably, Edomites are among the people that are saved. The children of Edom are not condemned to damnation because they had a father named Esau. They're like all other Gentile nations. So that's that particular section. Now, on the next page, there's two paragraphs, but this one here is the big one. Romans 9:14 to 29. These passages are really, really tricky. But I do think they need to be read in continuity with what has gone before. What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. God says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. So it depends not on man's will or exertion, but on God's mercy. And he says to Pharaoh, for example, I have raised you up for this very purpose, that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. You will then say to me, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, a man, to talk back to God? Will what is molded say to the molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay? What if God, desiring to show his wrath, make known his power, has endured with much patience the vessels, there's a key phrase, the vessels of wrath, made for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for, here's another key phrase, the vessels of mercy, which he has prepared hand for his glory, even us, whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. Now note how at the end of that section, he reiterates Jew and Gentile. That's his main issue. So I mention here, because this passage is often interpreted as a reference to vessels of mercy are interpreted as people who are getting saved. Vessels of wrath is interpreted as people who are getting condemned. But think of the potter metaphor. A vessel is something that contains something. The nation of Israel is God's vessel of mercy because she brings the message of salvation to the nations. She's like a clay pot. What's in the clay pot? The message of mercy. And the Gentiles are vessels of condemnation, particularly Pharaoh. Whether Pharaoh himself and the Egyptians are saved as individuals is a moot point. The issue is that they have become for all time a story of what God will do to the godless. This is what happens. So I mention here, this is like the story of Esau and Jacob. God is like a potter. The nations are the vessels he makes to carry his message to the world. The Jews were originally vessels of mercy. They carried the message of salvation. But now, here's the paradox. They've become vessels of wrath, carrying the message of reprobation. And God has the right to do that, as the story of Pharaoh shows. And then, of course, Paul's kinsmen, his fellow Jews, will likely say, if God wants to use us as a nation, as vessels of wrath, and he's getting his use out of us, he shouldn't blame us for rejecting Christ. After all, this is what he wants. But Paul says, in effect, that's God's business. And of course, Paul is himself a Jew. Presumably, he would ask his fellow Jews, you should join the new Israel. You should step out of the old Israel. So quick note on those passages. Let me stop, though, and see if there's any question or comment about that, because that's a big chunk right there.
This is wonderful. I've never heard this presented this way.
Well, some people will and some won't. Now, these passages are generally interpreted within a Calvinist framework, or if you're an Arminian, then you swing back. Those are the only two ways to view it, and the way I'm presenting it is, I don't think that's what Paul's talking about. I just don't think that's what he's talking about.
Well, it fits in the context, too.
Context is key because Paul has raised the issue of Jew and Gentile from chapter 1 all throughout. And so that's why people who take this view will say, look, we need to read this within the historic context of the first century, what's going on in Rome. The Old Testament passages Paul himself quotes, because we can't just, because people read Old Testament passages and then they skip over them, because they don't know the Old Testament that well, and then they view the passage entirely within the framework that they're accustomed to. So those things are the arguments there. So as I read this, a Calvinist and an Arminian both could go with it. It doesn't swing the passage either way, though it may cut the feet out from people who want to say that this passage forces us so to speak, into a Calvinist framework. I don't think that it does. Other passages can be adduced. And Arminians will sometimes interpret these passages against the grain of what they obviously say, because they're still within that framework. And that's always a trick, when you get involved in doctrinal controversies. Well, you've been involved in doctrinal controversy. People take passages of Scripture that don't fit their theory. And what's the word people use? They spin them. They spin them. And that's always distasteful. But I don't think Paul is arguing for either of these. We can talk about them. I put them up on the board and just to kind of let everybody know, and I'm assuming most of you are familiar with them to some degree. My parents were raised Pentecostal, and that's like Arminianism on steroids. And many of you come from Presbyterian or Calvinist backgrounds, so that's fine. Some of you come from Roman Catholic backgrounds. And Roman Catholicism is not Calvinist. Whatever else it is, it's not Calvinist. Traditionally, the Greek Orthodox Church doesn't even go for this kind of stuff. It's a divine mystery. And increasingly, as we wade into theological no man's land, that's attractive to a lot of people to just say, you know what? We don't know. I've felt the attraction of that myself because they just say, we do have Greek Orthodox theologians now that are poking their nose into all of this. But that wasn't the case. That's only been maybe 30 years, 40 years. That's been the case. Yeah.
What do we know, if anything, about the makeup of the congregation in Rome? This letter was written to. Was it predominantly Jewish?
It goes back to lesson 1, but I'll say it's Jewish and Gentile mixed. Predominantly Gentile, though.
Because to me, it seems these are some pretty tricky arguments from using all these Old Testament passages.
That's right.
And this is all written in a letter.
And it's written in a letter into a church that he did not himself establish.
Exactly.
One of the reasons why we like the letter to the Romans is because since Paul did not establish that church, unlike Corinthians, you read Corinthians 1st and 2nd, you always feel like you're walking into a conversation in the middle. That there's all kinds of things going on that Paul understands and that the writers understand, and you're trying to piece it together. But Romans isn't like that. And so since he's visiting Rome, and he did not found that church, in a certain sense, he's presenting himself as if to strangers. And that means that his presentation of the gospel in this book, above all others, is more thorough and self-explanatory than any other. So I don't think it's an accident that Romans is a key text in the New Testament. But one of the big issues is, even though the Gentiles are in the majority at Rome, the Jews are what you might call the moral majority. They're not majority in terms of number, but they have a certain pedigree, because all of these Gentiles are worshiping the God of Israel, who they claim to represent. And Paul has two big problems here. On the one hand, he has the problem of Gentiles who want to say, well, the Jews, that was great and everything, but now we're the stuff. And I think Paul wants to say, well, hold on. Being Jewish is not a non-thing. They are God's vessel of mercy to the nations. How does he put it? Entrusted with the very oracles of God. On the other hand, he does also want to say to the Jews, your badges of specialness circumcision and temple worship and other things. You were elected to perform a service. That service has now been performed. And so you're going to have to accept that on the basis of faith alone, you and these other nasty Gentiles are brothers and sisters. Which, if you read Galatians and other parts in the New Testament, that's a big issue. Big issue. I think that's really what Paul is dealing with in these passages. So, is it about God's sovereignty? Absolutely. That's what these chapters are about. But he's not addressing a bunch of people who aren't saved and need to be saved. He's addressing Jews and Gentiles who are both saved and trying to tell them how to live and work together and understand one another. And so this has to do with Jew versus Gentile as nations and not the salvation of individual people, which is not a non-issue. Christians are going to dispute the salvation of individual people. As far as I can tell, we'll probably still dispute it in heaven. I believe God has an antechamber, so after we're let through the pearly gates, he'll send a bunch of people into an antechamber for about 1,000 years and say, all right, you keep arguing, and when you're done, then we'll come in, you can move into the main room. That's a joke. He didn't let me in on that. You always have these jokes about people who get to heaven. Anybody, what's that? Oh, don't tell them. They think they're the only ones here. The one about the wall, and there's these people over there. It's whoever's behind the wall changes from joke to joke. Sometimes it's the Baptists, sometimes it's the Pentecostals, sometimes it's, so the nice thing about those jokes is you can always, they're like blonde jokes. I grew up with blonde jokes, but those are no longer politically correct. Actually, most of the jokes I grew up with are no longer politically correct. I'm thinking back when I was in second, third grade, most of the jokes were about men and women and different racial groups and sexual orientation, and we just thought they were funny. But can you imagine telling those jokes today? They would not go over well. All right, final thing on this 2-page bit, Romans chapter 9, verse 30 to 33. What shall we say then? So here, the logic of everything he's saying, Jew and Gentile, Jew and Gentile, Jew and Gentile. The question is, what's the point of having a Bible if we foist on it our own views? The point of having a Bible is so that Paul can tell us what it is that he intends to get across. The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, but the Israel who pursued righteousness did not succeed in fulfilling the law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by, here's the key word, faith, but as if it were based on works. So what accounts for the great role reversal between Jew and Gentile? Paul is saying, the Jews are zealous for the Torah, but they've misunderstood the Torah. Jewish circumcision, that's his main issue, is a sign of their role as a vessel for salvation. But a person can be a vessel for salvation without themselves being saved. Paul says that in Corinthians. I'm a pastor. I read it all the time. If I, commending other people to the salvation that comes through Christ, what benefit to me if I lose out on the prize, right? Can pastors commend their congregations to a salvation in a lifestyle that they themselves do not engage in? I think it's evident that they can. And so, to win the whole world and lose one's own soul, how does that benefit you? So you can be a vessel of salvation without being saved. Paul, before his conversion, would have been one of those. He was a Jew, and as a Jew, he brought the message of salvation to the world, but he himself was fighting against the Messiah of the Jews. So that's a paradox. And I think this issue cuts very close to the heart of Paul, because he himself was one of the people that he's arguing against in this passage. Oh, maybe I use this metaphor here, and we'll close with this. If I'm a policeman, I can wear a badge. That does not make me a law-abiding citizen. It means I got a badge. It means I have a role to play. Circumcision is like that. But the Jews had got the idea that wearing the badge was the main thing. And we can all do that. Wearing the badge is not the main thing. And indeed, if law-abiding citizens were all throughout the world, then we wouldn't need badges. What did Alexander Hamilton say? If men were angels, no law would be necessary. So, Paul is saying that we've entered into a new... So, here, this bit on Romans chapter 9 through 11 is key passages and how, let's suppose we took this reading, how would these passages read? Now, is that the only way to read them? No. This way of reading these passages is pretty old, over 1,000 years old. So it should not be dismissed lightly. And so that's why I presented up there. Now, if we want, we can talk about these two views, which I think we've talked about before, but I think these are side issues. I don't think that's what this passage is about. And then when you go into chapter 10 and 11, I think it becomes increasingly apparent that the flow of Paul's thought is in that same direction. But let me stop and see if there's any question or comment, because whether you realize it or not, I get a lot out of these classes. I don't just teach them to tell you what's on my mind. When you come up with objections or when you raise issues, does it help me? Of course it does. That's exactly what we're here to do. If you want to be preached at, well, that'll happen later in the service. Because I'll be behind the pulpit, and if you throw tomatoes at me, then I can duck, and you can't hit me. But you said earlier you'd never really heard that view before. That is part of the new perspective on Paul reading, some of which has value, some of which is probably false, some of which is really kind of fuzzy, and it's not easy to tell what direction it's going.
The thing I like about it is at least the context. That's the main. I mean, just from studying Revelation, it was like that's where I learned how important context was.
Well, those of you who know, we'll just go through this a little bit. Some people have heard of the tulip. All right. Do you know the tulip, Eli?
I'm pretty sure.
You nodded your head. What's the T?
Total, it's...
Some of you have heard of the 5 points. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Total
depravity?
That's it. Okay. And again, these are 5 theological points that hang on this chapter particularly, but the ones that follow that have to do with this issue. Anybody know the U? Of course. You want to do it again?
Yeah, unconditional election.
There it is. Okay, unconditional election. And they all have to be read in context of this, the salvation of the individual person. The argument is That's what Romans 9 is about, the salvation of the individual person, the salvation of the individual person. So basically what I'm not promoting Arminianism, I'm saying it has nothing to do with either of those issues. What is the L? Limited, that's it, limited atonement. That's probably the most controversial of the 5 points, because it implies that Jesus didn't die for everybody.
Well, that's most Calvinists don't believe that.
But so what you have is, what would an educated Calvinist say? Not like,
Educated, say most Calvinists don't believe
yeah, what would most Calvinists say?
that. John, that Jesus died for the world. So that's a misnomer right there. So
Right,
I don't want people to go away confused.
right. And so
That's not, most Calvinists would not agree with that.
what would they say that
It only
means?
fits really well in the TULIP acronym. That's one reason
I disagree. The argument is a good argument.
it's a terrible argument, because the Gospel of John's made it clear, Jesus died for the world. But it's effectual for the world.
can
For
say
only
that
those who were chosen and drawn.
You can say the world, meaning the people of his chosen, the people that he chose. And limited atonement, the way that it was presented to me, and I thought it was a valid argument, that for instance, if he died for people that weren't saved, then there's 2 prices being paid.
No, that's
In
not
other
true.
words, they're going,
That's
the
not true.
people are damned, and he paid for it, so it's paid for twice, and that
You're taking
doesn't
reprobation way
make,
too far. He
it's,
died for
it's
the
a,
world, it was effective for the world, but only those who are drawn.
I'm not saying I agree with that, I'm just saying it's a valid argument.
I think you're saying this is how it was presented to you.
Oh, absolutely, and I
never
bought it.
And I think you're saying that,
Most Calvinists wouldn't agree with that, and I would say also Calvin didn't agree with that.
well, that's fine, but you're saying this is how it was presented to you.
It made sense.
That's how it was presented to you. Now, how do you think would be a proper way to present this
You're
one?
going to have to ask Eli, because he's the guy.
No. He gave me the word.
Eli is the guy with the answers.
Okay, he didn't want to say. All right. What does the I stand for?
Irresistible grace.
Irresistible grace. I like irresistible grace because it reminds me of The Godfather. An offer you can't refuse.
Now, people will never forget irresistible grace.
He gives us an offer we can't refuse. Well, I mean, but I would be interested, though, because what happens, because of the way it was presented to you, anytime there's a contentious theological issue or any other issue, people tend to misrepresent their opponents. Well, you guys know that. When people get in a contentious issue, they misrepresent the opposite side. It's called a straw man. You misrepresent them and then you knock them over. And so one of the things we want to do, if I'm on internet or X or anything like that, the views of Calvin are often cast in their most negative possible light by their opponents. Absolutely. And then people just come in like hound dogs and tear it apart. That doesn't prove anything. It just proves how hostile they are to the ideas. So that's why I asked you a little bit about it, because the point here is not, I don't think Romans chapter 9 has to do with either of these. I don't think it does. But the point is not to misrepresent either of them, and people do tend. Of course,
Eli? Wait, Eli.
Oh, Eli?
Perseverance.
There it is. All right, there it is.
Now I want to see Eli do the acronym for Arminianism.
Perseverance of the saints. Once saved, always saved. Is that a good way to put it?
Not necessarily.
Oh, how would you put it?
Well, Charlie shook his head, so I think Charlie should answer.
See, he has the right of veto, but then I don't get anything definite.
It's the work of the Holy Spirit.
Okay. Would it be appropriate to say you can't, if in truth you are saved, not you, like you appear saved, But if in truth you are saved, you can't lose that. That be a good way to put it?
Yeah, once God has elected you, nothing can change
I
that.
think Dan is raising his hand so we could see like some
Oh,
discussion here.
no, I'm glad though. We got a little energy in here. I felt some sparks, you know. Look, church is a place where people typically fall asleep, so it doesn't have to be that way. Now, this here is still open to some significant interpretive nuance, because I think what's come out in the discussion is that people have it presented one way to them. If you're a Calvinist who studies the Scriptures and your theology at great depth, then some of these points will be nuanced considerably, and that needs to be dealt with. Arminius considered himself a Calvinist. He rejected a number, he actually rejected 5 specific things. And that is what made Calvinism Calvinism. Calvinism never lays out in his institutes, these are my 5 points. The point is that at a certain point, Jacob Arminius said, well, I agree with Calvin in all but 5 points. And then he listed them, and at that point, the battle was on, because those became the people who subsequently became known as Calvinists, defended the 5 points that Arminius disagreed with. Because Jacob Arminius considered himself a Calvinist, just the same way Karl Barth does. Not everybody thinks he's a Calvinist, but that's how he thought about himself. But he said, there's 5 things that I disagree with, and so instead of...
Pastor Chad, just for a second.
Oh, yeah.
I want to see if I can agree with Terry on this one thing.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Terry, would you agree that Arminius needs a better acronym? That's a terrible acronym. Would you agree with that? Okay, so Terry and I agree on something.
Oh, you guys don't know that Arminius has a flower of his own.
See, the thing that you just said, too, is profound to me also, that Calvin never came out with those 5 points and said, this is what I
He didn't.
believe.
Absolutely not.
And he gets torn down all the time, and it's like everything else that he wrote and said and everything.
He's the best Bible commentator in the age of the Reformation, hands down.
Yeah,
But he's been reduced to 5 points.
that's nonsense.
That's right. Well, and I think people who defend Calvin are more Calvinist than Calvin himself was in some cases.
That's also
Calvin was just a very sincere Protestant Christian who was a very good Bible interpreter in the best of his day. But there were 5 points that Arminius disagreed with, and it set up this future dispute. Now, Calvin has the tulip, and Arminius has the daisy. You know about the daisy?
I've heard that.
He loves me, he loves me not. He loves me, that's a joke. These are not good. Total depravity, partial depravity. Unconditional election, conditional election. It's the opposite. Limited atonement, unlimited atonement. Irresistible grace, resistible grace. And there's not a good one for this, but the idea is that you can fall from grace. So that's how Jacob Arminius agreed with Calvin about most of the Reformation doctrines. He read Calvin's Bible commentaries. He did believe that we're not totally depraved, we're partially depraved. He did believe that God elects people as individuals, but on certain conditions. He did believe that Christ died for all, unlimited atonement. Now, therefore, if some aren't saved, it's not due to God's activity, it's due to ours. So that leads quite well into the next one. How can we stop God's will? Well, we resist. Did Arminius believe that we can resist God's salvation? Absolutely he did. He said we have free will, and God can give us an offer, but it's not an offer we can't refuse. we can refuse it. And this probably is the more controversial of Arminius' statements, that we can fall from grace. That one is the one that goes into some muddy waters. But the point is that these two become camps. From the days post-Martin Luther, and most Protestant, there's over 1,000 Protestant denominations. There's a lot of them. But you can still group them. And broadly speaking, Protestant denominations will fall into one of these two categories. Now, how is that relevant to what we're doing in Romans? Romans chapter 9 through 11, 9 particularly, has been viewed as a linchpin for these issues. I'm presenting in this class, I'm not preaching Arminianism, but I am teaching in this class that I don't think either one of these things is quite what Paul is getting at in Romans chapter 9. But the only way to do that is to read through the classical passages, because we read classical Bible passages and we get into tunnel vision, and we're just used to reading them in a certain way. So,
How does God being sovereign over everything, how does that overlay those two? I don't even know how it works.
this one and that one?
Yeah, because that's one of the, it's like, okay, so I'm pretty sure Scripture says that we're responsible for everything that we do, and God being sovereign over everything. And I just couldn't figure out how those two jive with each other. They seem contradictory.
So you have sovereignty versus what you might call free will, right? In both of these, Arminians tend to emphasize free will. Calvinists tend to emphasize sovereignty. Most Christians would agree. I think Calvinists and Arminians would both agree that we need both. How one reconciles them is very much a philosophical, conceptual issue that, in my own estimation, I don't think the Bible solves. What's that? So we all got to become orthodox. The Bible is not a philosophical book. I don't know if it's dawned on you. Are there passages that emphasize God's sovereignty? Sure. Are there passages that emphasize our freedom and responsibility? Plenty of those. And the danger then is that when we encounter scriptures, we may twist them to fit our particular emphasis, which we have to try to avoid the temptation of doing. So, I did decide, and then I'll have to let you go because I'm a few minutes past time. I decided to take today out, though, because we just finished Romans chapter 9. It's such a big chapter, to make it clear, what are we doing here? What are we doing with this chapter? And what are we not doing? This is what we're not doing here. But both of those views have teeth in them, and they have a long history in the Protestant church. So, we can talk more about this, but I'm going to close this with a word of prayer, and I'll let you go.